The narrator and his wife, Alaya, have always shared a deep and unwavering bond. Their relationship is built on trust, communication, and understanding. Their connection is something that feels unshakable, a partnership that has stood the test of time. Despite the love they share, life still presents challenges, and one of those challenges comes in the form of Tom, the narrator's longtime friend. Tom is currently going through a rough patch in his marriage to Lucy, a situation that weighs heavily on him. The narrator has always been there for Tom, offering support and a listening ear. However, the bond of friendship is about to be tested in ways the narrator never imagined, setting the stage for a series of events that will begin to unravel his own sense of security. It was late one night when the phone rang, the sound slicing through the quiet of the house. The caller ID flashed Tom's name, and the tone in his voice when the narrator picked up sent an immediate chill down his spine. Tom was shaken, his words trembling. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of something unspeakable. He didn't say much more, but it was clear that something serious was happening. The narrator, already concerned, agreed to meet Tom immediately. He woke Alaya, explaining the situation briefly before leaving. The sense of urgency in Tom's voice left the narrator on edge, but he couldn't shake the growing sense of mystery about what exactly Tom was going through. Whatever it was more than just marital issues. It felt like a storm was brewing. When the narrator arrived at Tom's house, he found his friend in a state of complete emotional ruin. Tom was pacing back and forth, his eyes red and swollen from crying. Finally, he blurted it out. "Lucy, she's been cheating on me." The words hit like a punch to the gut, leaving the narrator speechless for a moment. Tom collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands as the weight of the betrayal seemed to consume him. His voice cracked as he spoke about how he had discovered the affair and the uncertainty of what to do next. The narrator sat beside him, feeling the depth of Tom's pain, but at a loss for how to help. As Tom's friend, he wanted to offer comfort, but the right words were hard to come by. After a long pause, the narrator finally suggested, "Maybe you should leave her. Start fresh. You deserve more than this." Tom nodded slightly, but the despair still lingered in his eyes. His pain hadn't subsided, but the narrator could see that the thought of leaving Lucy, though daunting, offered a flicker of hope. Yet a silent question echoed in the back of the narrator's mind. How fragile was the trust in his own marriage? The next day, the narrator left Tom's home, still heavy with the weight of the night's conversation. To clear his mind, he joined a group of old friends for their annual weekend getaway at a cabin. It was a tradition that they had kept alive for years, a time to relax and recharge, away from their everyday lives. The group was lively and lighthearted, joking and reminiscing about their shared memories. The narrator tried to focus on the laughter, but Tom's confession still lingered in his thoughts. As the evening wore on, the conversations turned to relationships, and the narrator found himself listening more closely than usual. The familiarity of the group, the laughter, and the warmth of the fire didn't quite erase the discomfort that had settled in his chest. Little did he know, this weekend would bring to light troubling realizations that would begin to shake his own faith in the relationship he thought was rock solid. As the group drank, the atmosphere became more relaxed, and the talk turned to relationships. At first, it seemed harmless, stories about their partners and marriages, but as the night wore on, the tone began to shift. The narrator's friends made unsettling comments about controlling their wives, about monitoring their actions, and even keeping track of their whereabouts. The remarks were casual, but carried an undertone of something darker, something that didn't sit right with the narrator. He defended Alaya, adamantly stating how much he trusted her and how strong their relationship was. But the comments continued, with the group laughing off the notion of total honesty and mutual respect. The narrator, though uncomfortable, tried to dismiss their words as misguided jokes. Still, something about the conversation planted seeds of doubt in his mind. He laughed along with his friends, but in the pit of his stomach, a growing unease began to take root. How well did he really know those around him? And could there be cracks in the relationships he'd once considered impenetrable? That night, as the narrator lay in the cabin's guest room, a sense of unease gnawed at him. He reached for his phone and dialed Alaya's number, hoping to hear her familiar voice. But the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. And again. Each unanswered call sent a ripple of discomfort through him. He tried to push it aside, reminding himself that Alaya was probably busy or out with friends. But the longer the silence stretched, the more his mind raced. He rationalized it, but the knot of worry in his stomach only grew tighter. He could feel the unease from the conversation with his friends creeping into his thoughts. His fingers hovered over the phone, a growing sense of suspicion gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, even though he didn't have any evidence to back it up. The narrator tried to focus on the weekend's festivities, but every time he glanced at his phone, the unease returned, stronger than before. When the narrator finally returned home, Alaya greeted him with warmth and affection, a radiant smile that felt like a balm for his frayed nerves. The sincerity in her embrace, the way she pressed a kiss to his cheek, temporarily wiped away the lingering doubts in his mind. They spent the evening together, sharing a quiet dinner and curling up on the couch to watch their favorite movie. The intimacy between them felt comfortable, safe, like everything was back to normal. For a while, the narrator felt at peace, reassuring himself that his fears had been nothing more than an overreaction to a strange, unsettling weekend with friends. Alaya was the same, loving and attentive as always, but deep down, the echo of his friend's words and the images of Tom's betrayal gnawed at him, gradually dimming the comfort Alaya's presence had given him. A small, uncomfortable seed of doubt took root once more, even if he couldn't articulate why. He had wanted to trust her, but now a shadow of suspicion lingered in his mind. That night, as Alaya slept soundly beside him, the narrator lay awake, his thoughts racing. The weight of the day's emotions left him restless. He told himself that he was being irrational, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but the urge to investigate, to seek some kind of confirmation, was undeniable. His eyes darted toward Alaya's phone, resting on the bedside table, the device innocently perched within reach. It was as if an invisible force pulled him toward it. The narrator hesitated, heart pounding in his chest, knowing that what he was about to do might change everything. Despite the trust he felt, despite the love he shared with Alaya, the suspicion had become too overwhelming to ignore. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached out and unlocked her phone. The screen illuminated in the dim room, and the suspense in the air thickened as he began scrolling through her messages. Every message, every notification felt like an entry into a world he had never expected to see. What the narrator found on Alaya's phone was nothing short of a gut-wrenching revelation. Hidden in plain sight, there it was, an app he had never seen before, a dating app. His stomach churned as he clicked on it, disbelief and anger bubbling up in his chest. There, staring back at him, was Alaya's profile. Different name, different photos, images he didn't recognize. His breath caught in his throat as he scrolled through the messages. They were flirtatious, intimate even, conversations that should never have existed between her and someone else. As he continued reading, it became clear that Alaya had been seeing someone during the very weekend he had been away with his friends. The timeline matched. The messages confirmed it. His mind reeled as the full scope of the betrayal hit him. Alaya had been unfaithful, her smile and affection now tainted by the truth he had just uncovered. Anger surged through him, but it was overshadowed by a crushing sense of disbelief and heartbreak. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of it all. How had he missed this? What was left to trust? The urge to confront Alaya immediately was almost overwhelming, but the narrator, still in shock, fought to maintain control. He carefully placed the phone back on the table, taking a moment to collect his thoughts, his mind racing. He needed to plan this. He couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. Rage, hurt, and confusion were already clouding his judgment, but he was determined to stay calm, at least for now. His hands shook as he began gathering Alaya's things, packing them into bags. Each item he picked up seemed to symbolize the life they had built together, now in ruins. His heart hammered in his chest, but he remained focused, determined to face her in the morning. When she woke, he would show her the proof, and then he would demand answers. The thought of doing this in the light of day, when Alaya would be at her most vulnerable, gave him a strange sense of control. But even as he prepared for the confrontation, a part of him still wrestled with the anger and disbelief, wondering how things had gone so wrong. When morning came, the narrator's emotions were on the edge of breaking. He stood in the dim light of their bedroom, waiting as Alaya stirred awake. The confusion in her eyes was evident as she saw his cold, detached demeanor. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice unsure. She probably thought this was just another argument, another misunderstanding. But this was different. "Pack your things," the narrator said, his voice flat. Alaya's face morphed from confusion to alarm as she stood up, trying to reason with him. "What are you talking about? Why are you acting like this?" But the narrator didn't respond. Instead, he picked up her phone, unlocked it, and handed it to her. Her eyes widened in horror as she scrolled through the dating app, reading the messages that confirmed her betrayal. Her face drained of color and she stammered, "It's not what you think. I—" But her words faltered, her excuses crumbling under the weight of the undeniable truth. The narrator's anger reached a boiling point, and without a word, he pushed her toward the door. His voice was tight with emotion. "Leave, now." Alaya's protests and weak attempts at explanation faded into the background as the narrator, feeling emotionally drained, closed his eyes and breathed deeply, trying to suppress the hollow ache inside. As Alaya fell to her knees, crying and pleading for forgiveness, the narrator felt nothing but emptiness. Her apologies, her desperate attempts to explain herself, they all seemed so hollow, so disconnected from the person he thought he had known. The weight of her betrayal was like a heavy stone lodged in his chest, and no amount of crying or begging could undo it. She was still trying to justify herself, but he couldn't hear her anymore. His heart was numb, cold to the core. He guided her, with a firmness he didn't even recognize in himself, toward the door. "It's over," he said, his voice flat and detached. Alaya, tears streaming down her face, grabbed the few things she had packed and left, the door closing behind her with a finality that left the narrator standing alone in their home, feeling like a stranger to his own emotions. The life he had known was gone, and there was no going back. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the narrator struggled to process the whirlwind of emotions that had engulfed him. Anger, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal overwhelmed him, yet beneath it all was an eerie numbness. The silence in the house was deafening. The echo of Alaya's departure felt like a wound that would never heal. He couldn't stop replaying the moments leading up to this, her warmth, her affection, the life they had shared. But now it all felt like a lie. His friends offered support, helping him stay busy and distracted, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. His trust, once so solid, had shattered. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and the days seemed to blur as he tried to find a way to move on. But the pain of the betrayal was ever present, a shadow that loomed over him. Weeks passed in a haze of numbness, and the narrator had begun to rebuild his life in small, tentative steps. Then one day, the phone rang. It was Alaya. Her voice sounded different, strained, as though she had been crying. "I'm pregnant," she said, her words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. "The baby is yours." The narrator felt a mix of disbelief and anger rise in his chest. How could this be happening? How could she come to him now, after everything? The thought of a child that might be his stirred an unsettling sense of responsibility within him. Despite his anger, despite everything she had done, he knew he had to find out the truth. "I'll get a DNA test," he said, his voice cold. But he made it clear, no matter the result, forgiveness was out of the question. The future seemed even more uncertain now, the possibility of a child complicating his desire to move on and put the past behind him. Months passed, and the narrator kept his distance from Alaya, focusing on healing and rebuilding his life. His thoughts remained haunted by the betrayal, but he moved forward, piece by piece. Then one day, Alaya contacted him with surprising news. She had found someone else. This man was willing to accept both her and the baby, and they were happy together. A strange sense of closure washed over the narrator, though it was tinged with sadness. He had imagined a future with Alaya, but that future had crumbled in the wake of her lies. Now, as he stood on the edge of this new chapter in his life, he realized that he would never fully forget the woman he had once loved, or the betrayal that had shattered their trust. The chapter with Alaya had finally closed, but the emotional scars would remain, a constant reminder of the trust that had been broken.